Legend of the Jackal, Part 3. "Mr. Devlin, are you awake, sir?" cried a voice outside of the room. It was Detective Holland. The London fog was as thick as people had said. Alder had watched the sunrise in the hours he stood at the window and never saw the sun. It was a bleak world shrouded in a mist. The only hint of the day was the birds that chirped and the hands of the clock hanging next to the bedroom door. Perhaps Alder was deprived of sleep. He had not noticed the clock when looking about his room the previous night. Alder opened the door of his room and was greeted by the drab detective, who didn't appear to have slept any more than Alder. "Good morning, Mr. Devlin. I've taken the liberty of preparing a spot of breakfast. We can eat on our way to see Mr. Stewart if you would like." That will be fine, Detective," replied Alder as he glanced down the hall to see if there were any other details of the house he had overlooked. "I'll be down in just a moment." "Very well. I'll wait for you in the carriage." Mr. Stewart was waiting on a bench with two other gentlemen when Alder and Detective Holland arrived. The two other gentlemen did not wait for either of the men to exit the carriage before taking their leave. "Good morning, Bryce," Mr. Stewart called out to the detective as he stepped off the carriage. "Good morning, Mr. Stewart." "Mr. Stewart, this is Mr. Devlin. He will be assisting me with the disappearing children," Detective Holland explained as Alder emerged from the coach. Mr. Stewart looked to be of 70 years of age. His English accent was a bit thicker than Detective Holland's. He was a man of London. His skin was fair. The only sun that he had ever seen was a diluted light that somehow managed to break through the gray cloud that engulfed the city. Despite his dull surrounding, he was a man who gave off a special warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Stewart," Alder greeted as he shook the old man's hand. "I understand that you have a bit of information for us." "That I do, my young chaps. Sit down, will you?" Detective Holland sat next to Mr. Stewart on the bench, while Alder propped himself against the carriage. "Well," Mr. Stewart began, "it was 3 days ago when I first learned of your coming to London, Mr. Devlin, that young Alice White came to me. I was sitting here with the fellows from the pub, and she came to show us her new shoes. She was very proud of them shoes. She did a little dance right here. It was very cute. Us old-timers are easily taken by any kindly conversation, even that of a 7-year-old girl. She went on about those shoes for nearly half an hour. She nearly had me convinced that I needed a new pair of shoes as well. After she left and went home, we didn't think much else of it. But the next evening, as I was walking home, something evil fell about." There was a pause in Mr. Stewart's voice, and Alder couldn't stand this kind of hesitation. "What does any of this have to do with the missing children, Mr. Stewart?" Mr. Stewart reached below the bench and picked up his bag. He opened it up and pulled out a small shoe fit for a very young girl. It looked to be barely worn, practically brand new. The detail that grabbed the men's attention, however, was the spot of blood that had stained the toe of the shoe. "You see now, gentlemen, I sent for you as soon as I came about the poor girl's shoe. Bryce, unfortunately, you had already gone to Penzance to pick up Mr. Devlin. I fear there is little hope for little Alice White, but maybe you two can finally catch this monster," Mr. Stewart declared. "Where did you find it, Mr. Stewart?" asked Detective Holland. "That's the strangest thing, Bryce. It fell from the old church up from the old cemetery." "What do you mean it fell from the church?" asked Alder. "Just that, Mr. Devlin. I was walking along and it dropped from the roof of the church. I looked up to see where it had fallen from and I seen it." Mr. Stewart was drained of his warmth upon recalling the events of that day. He scarcely seemed the same man. What did you see, Mr. Stewart?" Alder urged. "I looked up and seen the shadow of what appeared to be a man, yet it could not have been any man. It leaped from the columns and dove into one of the broken windows with no regard for gravity. I have never in my long years beheld any man who could move in such a manner. What you search for can be found in the old church. Surely it is a demon. I suggest you take God with you." Detective Holland was a bit agitated at the foolish ideas of Mr. Stewart. "Mr. Stewart, how could you, an educated man, possibly believe in such a notion as demons and such?" Mr. Stewart held the little shoe out in front of him in his shaking hand. "I may have my doubts of what I've seen upon the roof of that church, but I confess no uncertainty to my belief that no man would hurt so many children, least of all, little Alice White. "How far is this church?" asked Alder. "Not far at all," answered Detective Hollum. The carriage sped off through the fog. Detective Hollum's driver evidently needed no instruction, and he knew just by hearing Mr. Stewart's story where to go. Alder was in an excited state. It was the first break he had had in a long time. Sure, he had found clues before, but they were clues to cases similar to the disappearance of Jack, only in that they involved children. Alder had solved quite a few cases involving the disappearance of missing children. In a few instances, he even found the children and was able to return them to their homes unharmed. In those cases, it was mainly due to the child becoming lost in the woods. Most of the cases Alder Devlin worked, however, were children taken without a trace, taken by what Mr. Stewart described as a demon. "We mustn't jump to any conclusions," Alder urged his partner. "This Alice girl's disappearance may have been the work of an entirely different culprit." "Right you are, Mr. Devlin, but if it's all the same to you, sir, I figure any man who would harm a child, regardless of my investigations, should be subject to the fullest extent of the law." Detective Hollum's anger and need for vengeance was coming through in the tone of his voice. "I couldn't agree more, Detective," Alder replied as he pulled a pistol from his bag. "I've brought two if you care to hunt." "Thank you, Mr. Devlin, but I've brought my own." Detective Hollum reached into his dull brown coat and pulled out a pistol similar to Alder's, a bit more fancy with silver inlay upon the hilt, but similar in every other way. The carriage pulled to a halt, and the two men jumped quickly from the cart. They stared up at the ruins of the church. Alder thought the church must have been hundreds of years old. At any moment, this holy wreck would crumble and fall. It would be dangerous stepping into the church. It would be suicide to actually pursue a manhunt within the walls of such a place. "Send for Constable Hopkins and inform him of Mr. Stewart's findings," Detective Hollum said to his carriage driver in an urgent tone. His driver gave no word of response. He had learned that less time wasted was better, and that time wasted on words to signify an understanding of his orders could possibly be the difference between a child's life and a funeral for a small body. Alder pulled back the hammer of his pistol as he spoke to Detective Hollum. "I'll go in first. You follow, and keep an open eye out for any assailant who may attack us as I go in."